This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. On a warm spring day in early June of 1971, two friends, Richard Williams and Wayne Swikert, spent a Saturday afternoon at the high school they had graduated from just days earlier, Vineland High School in Cumberland County, New Jersey. Why spend a precious Saturday on school grounds? It was the annual end-of-school yearbook signing. It only took about an hour. After that, the two friends put Vineland in their rear view and headed south for Florida. The only problem was, anyone who knew Ricky and Wayne understood that they were missing their third musketeer, their best friend, Mike Newell. Why wasn't Mike at the yearbook signing, people wanted to know. The boys shrugged their shoulders, said their goodbyes, and hit the road. Their Florida vacation would be short-lived, however, when, 3 days later, their buddy Mike's body would be pulled from a pond. Hand and feet bound with tape, in a remote, sprawling nature preserve called Menantico, locally known as the Menantico Ponds, due to the several small bodies of water that dot the more than 300 acres of lush wilderness left over from the decades of sand mining in the area. Many areas of New Jersey were once heavily mined for the high quality and abundant sand found in concentrated locations. I grew up with abandoned sand pits in my town, and there were ponds there that older kids would drive their trucks through. There would be bonfires, parties, drinking, all the things kids did before technology took over. Well, down in Menantico, the area was once pockmarked with large, deep pits that produced millions of tons of sand. Over the years, those pits filled with water, and today they're beautiful, clear ponds. But back in 1971, one of those ponds became a murder scene. Or did it? Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Devil Went Down to Jersey. So, in Season 1 of The Devil Within, we told the terrifying story of Tommy Sullivan, the 14-year-old altar boy who brutally murdered his own mother before allegedly taking his own life. I say allegedly every time I talk about this because no one has ever really figured out how he managed to do all the damage to his body by himself. It was an exceptionally brutal crime scene, one that could easily be imagined when the topic of satanic murder is brought up. Same with the Fall River murders in Massachusetts more than a decade earlier. Brutal, ritualistic slayings that resulted in desecrated and abused bodies of the deceased. But with the case of Mike Newell, there wasn't any blood, none of the gore, nothing that could easily be associated with an occult murder. Now, to be fair, as soon as police began investigating, they discovered a trove of personal writings that pretty clearly spelled out the entire tragic tale. But on the surface, it seemed like your run-of-the-mill amateur murder. I mean, not even the mob guys in Jersey would dump a body in the Menantico Ponds. Too risky, with all the hikers, campers, and high school kids roaming around the woods. So, what happened to Mike Newell? First off, Cumberland County is about as South Jersey as you can get. The only more southern part of the state is the Cape May Peninsula. Cumberland County and its largest city, Vineland, sit due west of Atlantic City on the eastern shore of the Delaware Bay, just across the water from Dover, Delaware. The county was founded in 1748 and named after Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland. The municipality of Vineland, the most populous in the county, was incorporated in 1952, although the Vineland High School dates back to 1870, and today has an enrollment of nearly 3,000 students. Vineland, along with all of Cumberland County, is part of the larger Philadelphia metropolitan area. In the late spring of 1971, Vineland High School had just graduated another class of hopeful seniors and was shutting down for the summer. except for those poor souls who required a little additional instruction and needed summer school to guarantee they'd move on to the next grade level in the fall. But kids were starting summer jobs, planning trips to the famous Jersey Shore, maybe vacations abroad with family. But one kid had been harboring a dark secret and was making an entirely different set of plans. His goal was to command 40 legions of demons from the depths of hell. But to accomplish this, Mike Newell would need the help of his two best friends. When Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible was published in 1969, it caused a huge stir in religious communities across the United States. Many libraries refused to stock the book, and the resulting publicity made it a must-read in many circles, especially for those among the societal fringes. At Vineland High School during this time, there were 4 distinct groups of kids: greasers, jocks, hippies, and nerds. These groups were basically equally respected within the high school landscape, and all were able to peacefully coexist. But what if you didn't fall into one of those categories? What if you were outcast, adrift? Where could a kid like that find a place to stand? Well, Mike Newell found Satanism. Maybe it was the Satanic Bible that caught his interest, but there were definitely other volumes that he might have gotten his hands on. Books on demonology like The Lesser Key of Solomon or the Vatican's own Ritual Romanum. Whatever the case, Mike educated himself in the ways of Lucifer and fostered a great and increasing curiosity about how to grab some of that power that he read about. How could he transcend the norms of public high school in New Jersey and actually make something of himself? Sure, he was shunned and dismissed by his peers, but he soon jettisoned any concern over their petty, earthly, insufferably human concerns. He wanted more, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. It has been reported that sometime in late 1970, Mike had fallen in with an older woman who claimed to be a high priestess in the Church of Satan, a group founded a few years earlier in California. This woman claimed to be a witch, but a white witch, so, the good kind. She also allegedly introduced Mike to some of the more obscure satanic texts originating from medieval times, where these ancient theologians attempted to decipher various biblical translations regarding the hierarchy of the demons of hell and how to command them. Included within the pages of these ancient tomes were methods and procedures of how exactly to either summon these demons or, as was the expressed interest of Mike Newell, how to become their leader. But the interpretation Mike came up with was bizarre, arcane, and not really a thing, apparently. I'm going to digress here for a minute, just to be fair, because Satanism, believe it or not, has gotten a bad rap for the last 50 years or so. The nationally recognized Satanic Temple, although it pisses off the Abrahamic religion something awful, isn't what you probably think it is. There are no calls for murder in the name of Lucifer, no sacrifices, nothing illegal or deadly or grotesque. Yes, there are rituals, as there are in all religions, and they'd probably seem weird for the uninitiated. I'm not entirely sure, I'm not a Satanist, but I know that a Black Mass is a thing, which is basically a Catholic Mass run in reverse, and several of the sacred traditions are upended. But the Satanic Temple has a list of 7 fundamental tenets that, if you read them outside of the knowledge of their inception, you'd find yourself nodding your head in agreement. The first tenet, ready? Quote, "One should strive to act with compassion and empathy toward all creatures in accordance with reason." The second, quote, "The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions." Kind of makes sense. Also, there's one about our beliefs conforming with the best scientific understanding of the world. What? Where's all the murder and mayhem and tearing the heads off puppies? Well, that unfortunately does exist in rare, isolated incidents of usually disturbed individuals whose condition had slipped through the cracks, flown below the radar of people who might have been able to help them. That's what happened to Tommy Sullivan. I believe that the whole tragedy there could have been avoided if early in his downfall, either a coach or a priest or a teacher, anyone, sat him down and said, "Hey kid, you seem to be under a lot of pressure. Let's talk about it." Instead, he was forced to live alone with the weight of societal expectation as a 14-year-old kid, and he needed an escape, a release, to let off some steam, to just be a kid. Instead, he turned into a monster. And people blamed Satan instead of themselves, a phantom, a literary creation that was used as a scapegoat to relieve the community of their passive sins and get on with their lives. Mike Newell wanted to be in charge. There's that ridiculous saying that you usually can read on bumper stickers on the back of pickup trucks with the fake testicles hanging off the trailer hitch. You know what I'm talking about. It reads, "I'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven." Okay, good for you. Well, it seems that Mike was one of those guys. It was his understanding that under the right circumstances on earth, he would, after his death, rule over 40 legions of demons in hell. Why someone would want to do that is beyond me, but then I'm a pretty happy guy without any real grudges or complaints here on earth. Mike would have had to have been absolutely miserable to prefer that type of existence. Maybe he thought those demons would be able to settle some scores for him, vengeance from beyond the grave. Or maybe he thought that if he was this ruler in hell, that might get some girls to like him. I honestly don't know. What we do know is what the Vineland police chief, Charles Pangburn, testified to at a preliminary hearing in the days that followed the death of Mike Newell. The chief had interviewed one of Newell's friends, Ricky Williams himself, and Williams told an odd story to say the least. For the previous few years, the three boys, Newell, William, and Swikert, had all been cross-country runners together for the high school team. They spent their afternoons running through the pine forests of South Jersey, skirting the swamps that dotted the landscape, and they'd grown close. But then Newell slowly began to change. He quit the cross-country team, developed a new taste in music, and began talking about Satan and various aspects of the occult. According to Williams, Newell had fallen in with a, quote, Satan worshippers sect, and had decided that he needed to die a violent death in order to achieve his ultimate goal. As stated, the goal was to be the commander of 40 legions of demons from the very pit of hell itself. But what was that part about it all requiring a violent death? Well, that's where his good friends Ricky and Wayne come into the picture. Because most importantly, his death couldn't be a suicide. And as for satanic cults in the Vineland area, the opinions there were decidedly mixed. According to the former public safety officer, there were 0 reports of satanic activity reported to the police in the 12 months leading up to the Newell incident. But many local religious leaders were questioned, and it was reported that upwards of 70 local teenagers were in some way affiliated with satanic groups and regularly participated in ritualistic activity. Here are some clips from a show called Exposing Satan's Underground, featuring the great Geraldo Rivera and his in-depth reporting on teen involvement in satanic cults. And remember, this is in the late 80s, almost 20 years after the Mike Newell incident.
In Maine, a dozen churches were defaced with satanic symbols. In California, New Jersey, Alabama, and elsewhere, police have found inverted crosses and the remains of mutilated animals. But by far the most frightening of all are the reports of teenagers killing other kids in Satan's name. Item, Douglas County, Georgia.
I'm sorry for you, young lady, and I sentence you to a term of life in prison. I'm sorry for you, and I wish you good luck. Remove her from the courtroom, Mr. Sheriff.
17-year-old Melissa Ernest and 2 other teenage members of her coven admitted drinking her 15-year-old victim's blood, then dancing around her still warm body. Now listen to this report from a small town in Maine.
Yesterday's conviction of Scott Waterhouse for the murder of 12-year-old Giselle Cody may finally bring an end to talk of a satanic cult in the town.
Item, Long Island, New York. Police arrest 17-year-old Ricky Casso for the ritual murder of 15-year-old Gary Lowers. Casso gouged out his victim's eyes. As we've seen, the level of violence in these crimes committed in Satan's name is often appalling and savage, brutal enough to shock even hardened police officers. Detective Paul Hart thought he had seen everything. Then this veteran New Jersey officer saw how a suburban teenager murdered and mutilated his own mother.
I believe that evil will once again rise and conquer the love of God. If this pact is to your approval, sign below.
Just barely 14 years old, Tommy Sullivan had written this contract with the devil before he butchered his mother with his Boy Scout knife. The murder took place in the basement of the Sullivan family home.
As we came down here, we found Mrs. Sullivan laying on the floor just about in this area here.
Describe the condition of the body.
It appeared that her throat had been cut and a good portion of her face had literally been slashed away. Tommy died as brutally as his mother did, but at his own hands.
What did Tommy then manage to do to himself? What wounds did he inflict on himself to kill himself?
His first self-inflicted wounds were a series of wounds to his wrists. 3, if I remember correctly, deep enough to actually sever the arteries and the tendons in his arm, enough to snap back his wrist. And after doing that, he literally slit his throat from ear to ear with this 3.5-inch knife from the windpipe all the way back to the spinal column, and to the point of almost taking his head off.
Understandably unable to live with the gruesome memories in their family, Tommy's father and younger brother have moved out of state.
Do you think you can ever find it in your heart to forgive your son?
I don't know. I loved him dearly. But he also took my wife, who I loved.
How could this happen here? To a nice boy from a good Catholic school and a fine middle-class family. Sure, he was obsessed by the symbols. This is what his room looked like on the night of the murder and suicide. But heavy metal is not answer enough.
You're a veteran of Vietnam. Had you ever seen anything that brutal?
Certainly in an area like this, in a town like this, in a neighborhood like this, you don't expect to see that type of violence. And it was brutal. It was brutal, and there's few of us that will forget that.
Nor do you forget these drawings Tommy made just before he killed himself. But you continue to search for the reasons. What made Tommy? What made the others do it? As reporters investigating this story for months, we have a good idea of what's going on in this country. Our big question tonight is why. This is Detective Sergeant Paul Hart. Yeah, stand up, Paul. He's the man, the cop who investigated the Tommy Sullivan tragedy. I've never heard of wounds that ferocious, and the pictures are even more appalling. Pictures that we did not show here. Do you think, you're not a theologian, you're a cop, do you think that Tommy was possessed?
I think that possession is a state of mind, and it would have been a hell of an interview with Tommy had we located him. Certainly, like I had said before, his death was as violent as his mother's.
Father LeBar, you investigate these cases for the Catholic Church. Is it the Church's position that demonic possession is possible?
It certainly is. There have been many cases down through the centuries, many in our own decade, for example, of where the devil has actually possessed people and caused them to do many strange things.
So you believe it's possible?
I believe not only is it possible, it is a reality in some very select amount of cases.
Let's go to London for a quick exchange with Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy, I'm glad you're on the program. I'll interview you in greater detail in a couple of minutes. The one thing I have to ask you now, though, is, of course, the vast majority of your fans and the fans of heavy metal music are not Satanists. But there is no doubt, at least not in our reporting, that that heavy metal music plays a role. Every single kid whose case we know about, who committed a violent act in Satan's name, was also into heavy metal music. What's your response to that, Oz?
Well, I don't really know. All I do is make music, you know.
Yeah. Then he talks to Ozzy Osbourne and asks how maybe Ozzy could be helping to produce a generation of Satan worshipers because of, heavy metal music. Another major component to this whole situation in Vineland with Mike Newell is the heroin epidemic that had been exploding in New York City and had begun to infiltrate the suburbs, places like Vineland, and not just heroin, but the psychedelic drug LSD. It's been reported that Mike Newell had been experimenting, some say just flat out using, LSD for months leading up to his death. Sidebar, when does experimenting become using? Like, how many times do you have to experiment with the same drug until you're just considered a user of that drug? I don't know. Drug use was also widespread in the satanic community and was considered an essential component of the rituals these kids were participating in. Then there's the local pastor, Harry Snook. Snook was an important civic leader in Vineland and took great interest in the youth of the town, especially as it pertained to their spiritual condition. Unfortunately, it was later discovered that many members of the satanic sect had been hiding in plain sight in Snook's Sunday flock for many months in 1971, until they apparently moved on in early 1974. Snook was questioned many times in the Newell case, never as a suspect, and he gave the police tremendous insight into the attitudes and expectations of the teenage community in Vineland. The death of Mike Newell was deeply felt by Pastor Snook. So it was at a party on June 13th that Mike Newell approached his friends Ricky and Wayne with a business proposition. Mike had recently taken out a life insurance policy on himself for $4,000, equal to roughly $30,000 in today's money. If they did what Mike asked, again, what Mike asked, he would name them beneficiaries on the policy. But they would have to kill him, or at least help him die. Ricky and Wayne agreed, and 2 days later, on June 15th, 1971, the three friends met up at a designated spot in the Menantico sandpits and got down to business. Mike showed proof that he had made his friends beneficiaries and then told them what they would have to do. First, they would participate in a secret satanic ritual. One, by the way, that neither boy has ever fully disclosed. And then they would assist in securely binding Mike's wrists with duct tape, followed by his ankles. But where Mike really needed the help was with what came next. Ricky and Wayne would have to throw Mike into the pond. And it had to be deep enough that no matter how much Mike thrashed about, probably because he changed his mind the moment he hit the water, no matter how strongly his survival instinct took over, it wouldn't matter. He would find the violent death he had been yearning for. So, they tossed him in. Then they went to a yearbook party. While their obviously deranged and misguided friend was flopping around in a lonely sandpit pond, drowning as a result of the last bad decision he'd ever make, his so-called friends were hanging out, making their high school goodbyes, while they secretly schemed on how to spend their insurance money in Florida. Did they really think it would work out? Of course it didn't. Both Ricky and Wayne copped to their involvement right away, and their attorney tried to frame it as, get this, an assisted suicide. He seriously argued that. But nobody bought that story, and the kids were convicted of murder and would spend almost 20 years behind bars. While there may be earlier examples of satanic murder in the Garden State, I wasn't able to find any. But there are certainly tons more that followed the death of Mike Newell. But there haven't been any as weird as the murder of Mike Newell, because he did ask his friends for help. And this was corroborated by his own writings. It wasn't just Ricky and Wayne telling a story to stay out of jail. And Mike did name them as beneficiaries on his life insurance policy. The sad reality of the Newell case is that Mike probably could have found the help he needed to work through what must have been a very difficult time in his late teens. Instead, he decided to act on an incredibly loose interpretation of a specific sacrifice ritual, an interpretation that led him to believe that self-sacrifice via violent death would somehow equal a holy grail of sorts that would grant him eternal life in hell with 40 legions of demons at his disposal. For what purpose? Who knows? And Mike isn't telling. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.